Propaganda on steroids and Soviet tactics. US lawmakers have given their opinion on a perceived Russian threat. The Senate Intelligence Committee held its first public hearing this week as part of an investigation into alleged meddling in American politics.
These efforts are in fact at the heart of Russian and previous Soviet Union intelligence efforts.
The Soviets will be looking at other techniques.
This Russian propaganda on steroids. The Russians employed thousands of paid internet trolls and botnets to push out disinformation and fake news at a high volume, focusing this material onto your Twitter and Facebook feeds.
From these objectives, the Kremlin can crumble democracies from the inside out, achieving two key milestones. One, the dissolution of the European Union, and two, the breakup of NATO.
While lawmakers warned that Russian hacking may have influenced last year's Brexit vote and warned of further interference in the French and German elections, Putin shrugged off his accusers with a joke. Ronald Reagan, debating, I think, about taxes and addressing the Americans, said, "Read my lips. No."
Russian President Vladimir Putin says the Kremlin never interfered in last year's presidential election in the United States. Putin stressed that contacts between Russian diplomats and some campaign officials in the U.S. were merely part of their routine work. He said allegations to the contrary are lies and provocations. The Russian president noted that Moscow has many friends in the U.S. and hoped that its troubled relations with Washington would get back on track at some point. He said Russia wants to build friendly ties with the U.S.
The US Secretary of State has signalled a major U-turn in Washington's policy on Syria, which has long been a bone of contention between America and Russia.
There are signs of a pivot in the strategy dealing with Syria. UN Ambassador Nikki Haley said today that it is no longer the administration's priority to remove leader Assad from office in Syria. This is an about-face from the Obama doctrine. Manila Chan here tonight with the rest of the story. Manila, what's going on here?
Yeah, it's true, Ed. The U.S. diplomatic policy on Syria has now shifted its focus strictly to defeating ISIS and not allowing Syria to turn into a safe haven for terrorists. But it's this pivot that is making America's European allies quite uncomfortable, with much of the European states still seeking to oust Bashar al-Assad. They, of course, were eye to eye with the previous U.S. administration. Now, Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, said, quote, "Our priority is no longer to sit there and focus on getting Assad out." And her sentiment was echoed by Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, speaking in Ankara, Turkey today. He said Assad's future and the future of their country would be decided by the Syrian people, in sharp contrast to the Obama administration stance, where it seemed almost certain that the U.S. would take part in another violent overthrow of a sovereign nation and a government.
Last point with respect to Assad. It's not just my opinion. I think it'd be international opinion that Assad's lost legitimacy.
In a brief photo op, Secretary of State Tillerson wore his best diplomatic smile. And so did President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. But behind closed doors, Turkey has some serious bones to pick with the United States. Top of the list, the war against ISIS in Syria, right on Turkey's border. With few soldiers of its own on the ground, the U.S. has teamed up with a battle-hardened Kurdish force called the YPG. But to Turkey, the YPG is a bitter enemy and a terrorist group. It's demanding the U.S. cut off its support, something Mr. Tillerson would not promise to do.
What we discussed today were options that are available to us. They are difficult options. Let me be very frank. These are not easy decisions.
That didn't satisfy the Turkish foreign minister, who accused the U.S. of fighting one terrorist group, ISIS, with another, the YPG.
The support given to a terrorist organization that targets us has saddened us, and it has affected our relationship, and it has also negatively affected Turkish people's perspective and feelings towards the United States.
4 people were injured outside the Turkish consulate in Brussels after clashes between supporters and opponents of the Turkish government. The clashes erupted as the Turkish diaspora take to the polls to vote in a controversial referendum that could see President Erdogan's powers greatly expanded. A European Council watchdog described the referendum as potentially the road to autocracy. 3 of the injured were reportedly stabbed, and 1 person is in critical condition. We have friends inside. If something anything happens to our friends who are on duty on the ballot boxes, they have to know that we can bring the embassy crashing down on their heads. Turkish-European relations have been on rocky ground after the Turkish government's attempt to rally support among expats. Erdogan reacted furiously when Germany and the Netherlands restricted political rallies on their soil amid fears of growing tension.
There are now more than 5 million Syrian refugees displaced around the world. With the war in Syria in its 6th year, there are about 200,000 more Syrian refugees than there were 12 months ago. The majority of them have fled to neighboring countries. Turkey has almost 3 million Syrian refugees, and Lebanon holds just over 1 million. A year ago, the UN asked countries that aren't bordering Syria to step up their refugee acceptance. The goal is to find places for 500,000 refugees to resettle. So far, half of that goal has been reached. But pushback from faraway countries like the US has impacted neighboring ones. After President Donald Trump announced his now blocked executive order freezing the refugee program, Lebanon's president pushed for refugees in his country to be sent back to Syria. Beyond the 5 million Syrian refugees that have fled the country, there are millions of others who are displaced within its borders.
Police in Italy have arrested 3 Kosovan men and a child on suspicion of trying to blow up Venice's iconic Rialto Bridge. The detentions follow a series of overnight raids in the northern Italian city. Authorities say the alleged terror cell had expressed unconditional support for ISIL in wiretapped conversations. They said they decided to target the historic landmark in the hope of killing hundreds of tourists. The manager of the apartment building where the men lived said around 4 in the morning I saw that the staircase light was lit continuously. I went out onto the landing. I could hear voices coming from upstairs and saw the police. They had balaclavas and they told me to return immediately into my apartment. The chief prosecutor said the group, which had recently been monitored by police, also celebrated last week's terror attack in London. He said the alarm was raised with the return of a Kosovo man from Syria. We have checked all the contacts. We also managed to enter and control all their movements over the internet. Built in the 16th century and spanning Venice's Grand Canal, millions of tourists cross the Rialto Bridge each year.
The head of the European Commission has warned President Trump to back off from encouraging EU countries to break away. Jean-Claude Juncker says he'll promote independence for US states unless Trump stops.
The newly elected US president was happy that Brexit was taking place and has asked other countries to do the same. If he goes on like this, I'm going to promote the independence of Ohio and Texas in America.
The Chinese Ministry of National Defense has warned South Korea that its opposition to THAAD won't end with just words. That was the response of spokesman Woo Kyun at a regular briefing on Thursday when asked about reports that components of the THAAD system have already arrived in South Korea and that the system will be complete next month. Woo said Beijing has expressed its views on the matter to Seoul several times and that the reasons are clear. He went on to note that China and Russia's militaries held joint missile defense simulations last May and said they would hold joint drills again this year. But he didn't confirm whether this time they would involve actual troops and equipment. Beijing sees THAAD as a threat and has reacted with unofficial sanctions against Korean businesses and entertainers. The damage has been limited to the economy so far. But a few days ago, a retired Chinese admiral took a more hardline approach and urged his country to make a surgical strike on the site where the anti-missile system will be deployed.
Iran's Defense Minister Brigadier General Mohammad Hossein Dehghan has called on the U.S. to withdraw its troops from the Middle East and stop harassing regional nations. Dehghan said, quote, "An armed robber cannot expect to be welcomed with a red carpet after breaking into someone else's house." The Iranian defense minister made the comments after the top U.S. commander in the Middle East called for military action against Iran. General Joseph Votel on Wednesday described Iran as the, quote, "greatest long-term threat to stability in the region" and called for steps, including military action, to disrupt the Islamic Republic's influence and activities. Iran has repeatedly warned against any foreign attack on the nation, saying such a move will be met with a crushing response.
The assassination of a top Hamas leader in the Gaza Strip last week has raised tensions between Israel and Hamas.
A new video believed to be linked to Hamas threatens to kill Israeli leaders. The video shows various leaders within the Israeli government and the IDF through the crosshairs of a sniper scope, with a short message in Arabic and Hebrew reading, quote, "We will act in kind." Those threatened in the short clip include Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman, IDF Chief of Staff Gadi Eisenkot, Shin Bet Chief Nadav Argaman, Mossad Chief Yossi Cohen, IDF Deputy Chief of Staff Aviv Kochavi, Public Security Minister Gilad Erdan, and the commander of the new Oz Commando Brigade, Colonel David Zini. The video has been publicized by the Gaza-based Shahab News Agency and is believed to be in response to the assassination of senior Hamas terrorist Mazen Fukaha last week. Fukaha was sentenced by Israel to life in prison for helping to orchestrate suicide bombings during the Second Intifada that killed 9 Israelis. He was later released and exiled to Gaza as part of the Gilad Shalit prisoner exchange deal in 2011. Hamas blames Israel for Fukaha's assassination, however. The Jewish state denies culpability.
Israel has announced that it will cut its required payment to the United Nations by $2 million, and it's all because of a spat of recent anti-Israel votes.
The ideology is, I'm not going to fund something that is actively attacking me. Why pay for my own destruction, you know? And the UN is a perfect example of that. The UN Human Rights Council, for example, has passed over 60 resolutions since its founding in 2006 just against Israel, which is more than any other country combined.
Well, let's check out your report.
The General Assembly requires that all 193 member states pay a percentage of the United Nations budget based on their GDP. Failure to do so would cause a member state to lose its vote in the General Assembly. Foreign Ministry spokesman Emmanuel Nachshon has said that the $2 million will instead be used for developmental projects in countries that support Israel in the international arena. Israel has already cut close to $6 million from its contribution of $11.7 million following a UN resolution passed in December condemning Israel's settlement building in the occupied territories. Last week, United Nations Special Rapporteur to the Palestinian Territories Michael Lynk charged Israel with the subjugation of Palestinians' humanity and claimed that Israel had been cracking down on human rights campaigners. The claims were presented in a report given to the UN Human Rights Council during the Geneva-based organization's mandated session on Israel, otherwise known as Agenda Item 7. Israel is the only country targeted with a dedicated UNHRC agenda item. United States Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has publicly threatened to withdraw from the Council over its biased agenda item against Israel.
On Thursday, UN human rights investigators have said that 19 U.S. states have introduced bills that would curb freedom of expression and the right to protest. Investigators said this is an alarming and undemocratic trend that has derived ever since Donald Trump's election as president. Concerns for free speech in the U.S. has risen ever since President Trump has branded U.S. media as the enemy of the American people. Lately, there has been a push for stricter laws on expression since those against Trump have pursued persistent public protest against his controversial policies. In a statement, investigators said that the trend also threatens to jeopardize one of the United States' constitutional pillars, free speech.
This story this morning, oh my word. This guy was on a plane. He's a professor at Drexel University. He's super liberal. His name's George, how do you pronounce this? Ciccarello or something like that? That's his picture. So he's on a plane. He sees a guy, a nice Samaritan in first class, giving up his seat for a soldier.
So he tweeted this out. Some guy gave up his first class seat for a uniformed soldier. People are thanking him. I'm trying not to vomit or yell about Mosul.
Unbelievable.
Now keep in mind, the fella up in first class in the uniform, thanks to his service, he gave the guy from Drexel the opportunity to write dumb tweets.
Absolutely.
Right, the freedom.
So what do you think about that? Tweet us now. It's already creating a firestorm before the show. I can imagine during the show. We'll get to your comments.
This is the same guy that, Brian, remember in the past? You might not remember it, but, well, in the article, you can read this. He also called for white genocide at one point over the Christmas holiday,
Right.
and then hoped to abolish the white race.
He said, all I want for Christmas is white genocide. At the time, Drexel University came out and said that is completely disgusting and inappropriate. But a couple of days later, they said it was satire, it was protected speech. He continues his job at Drexel.
Starbucks is working with a Harvard startup that gives free coffee to people with opposing political views as long as they engage in polite discourse. Essentially, each person gets half a gift card, and then they have to meet up to get the free caffeine. Sounds good to me, but how do you find two sides on campus? Remember, it's only one side of this divide that silences the other. It's not the right who needs a bribe to keep from shouting down historians or beating up professors. And it says something that it's a company pushing this new diversity.
Basketball-crazy North Carolina is trying to quickly please the NCAA before they select 4 years of championship sites. College athletics governing body has said that it is deciding on locations for tournaments through the spring of 2022 and that it would not award any to North Carolina if the law known as House Bill No. 2 was still on the books. On Thursday, amid the mounting pressure, North Carolina's Republican-controlled legislature voted to undo HB 2, and Democratic Governor Roy Cooper signed the measure into law. But it wasn't clear if that would satisfy the NCAA, which made no immediate decision on North Carolina's fate.
Demanding the EU blocks a deal that would create the world's biggest seeds and pesticides company. Environmental campaigners turn out in Brussels to oppose the merger of Germany's Bayer and America's Monsanto.
We think these corporations already have a toxic grip on our food supply, and if these mergers are allowed to happen, then we think this is going to be a marriage made in hell. This is going to be bad for farmers, it's going to be bad for the consumer, and it's going to be bad for nature. And we think the European Commission should stop these mergers from happening.
A petition letter signed by 200 organisations has been delivered to the EU's competition commissioner. Bayer and Monsanto say the merger would bring billions of euros of investment and create several thousand new jobs. Monsanto has hit the headlines for its genetically modified seeds, condemned by some environmental activists.
There are growing fears that the Taliban now hold more ground in Afghanistan than at any point since the 2001 American invasion.
The Taliban today are probably stronger than they ever have been before. There's a limit of U.S. capability to push back on their gains. Afghan local forces aren't willing to contest the power of the Taliban in areas where the population supports them.
U.S. forces in the country believe the Taliban have some sort of insurgent control in at least 16 Afghan provinces covering over 9 million people. The Obama administration decided in 2016 to keep 8,400 U.S. troops in the country for the foreseeable future.
I think it's just a question of efficacy. I don't know exactly what the right number would be, but really the question is, are we losing ground to the very people that we fought back in 2001 and 2002?
Afghan officials estimate there are around 40,000 militants active across the country. The complex web of terror groups in the country has become a major national security concern. On one hand, there is the Islamic State versus the Taliban.
I think ISIS has a very limited lifespan in Afghanistan. The only thing the Taliban is going to take on harder than the Afghan government is a rival for Islamic legitimacy among the populace. ISIS itself is more brutality than the Taliban, which the Afghan population hated, but also less organized, doesn't have any kind of ruling structure at all.
On the other hand, there are concerns over the Taliban working with al-Qaeda.
If the Taliban is working with al-Qaeda yet again, and the numbers of al-Qaeda have grown in Afghanistan as well, if that is happening and there are plots against the homeland, then it is certainly in our interest to ensure that Afghanistan cannot return to being a safe haven.
We welcomed the recent...
The top U.S. military commander in Kabul, General John Nicholson, told the Senate panel last month more troops are needed to battle extremists.
In a written message to the United Nations, Pope Francis urged all national, international, and civic organizations to work with determination to promote the necessary conditions for a world without nuclear weapons. In his message released Wednesday, Francis said that the international juridical framework is grounded on peace, the pacific solution of disputes, and the development of friendly relations between nations. Wednesday's message was meant to coincide with a meeting in New York of a UN conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons. The Pope stated, an ethics and a law based on the threat of mutual destruction and possibly the destruction of all mankind are contradictory to the very spirit of the United Nations.
China has signed an agreement to build a combat drone factory in the Middle East. Earlier this month, Saudi Arabia's King Salman visited China to sign off on a series of deals amounting to $65 billion. Included in those deals was an agreement between Saudi Arabia and China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation, which allows the Beijing-based company to establish a factory to build combat drones in Saudi Arabia. The company currently manufactures the CH-4 UAV, a drone similar to the U.S. Air Force's MQ-1 Predator. The CH-4 can carry AR-1 missiles capable of hitting soldiers, tanks, and small boats within 1.5 meters of the target. The deal allows China to increase its manufacturing footprint in the Middle East, as well as promote stronger ties between Beijing and Riyadh.
The president has carried out a coup d'etat. Those the words of the head of Venezuela's National Assembly after the Supreme Court ruled it would take over the functions of the opposition-led Congress. The judges, seen as supporters of President Nicolas Maduro, have annulled many of the Assembly's decisions and claims it did not properly deal with a vote-buying scandal. This is a ruling against a people who voted for change in their country, said the head of the Assembly. The Supreme Court believes it can walk over the Venezuelan people. In the name of the people, I want to say clearly what this ruling means to us. This is simply trash, he says. In one of many reactions against President Maduro and the Supreme Court, the Organization of American States has backed up the National Assembly president, also accusing Maduro of carrying out what it calls a coup and an attack on democracy.
Americans love their UFOs, and if you think you've seen one, apparently you're not the only one, especially if you live in California. A new UFO reference book came out. It's written by a couple of experts in the subject. They say California has the most UFO sightings in the country. Now, in total, there have been more than 120,000 UFO sightings in the U.S. from 2001 to 2015. In that time, the Golden State saw almost 16,000 of them. And apparently, it's not just the crazies out there running around saying they finally saw one. One of the authors says the majority of the people were sincere and just wanted to get it off their chest. The authors say reported sightings usually go up during the spring and summertime since more people are hanging around outside.
On a day full of jokes and pranks, a real comet will swoop close to Earth. Comet 41P is known by the nickname April Fool's Day Comet thanks to the timing of its closest approach to our planet. Comet 41P makes its way around the Sun every 5.5 years, but this visit marks its closest point to us for over a century. Astronomers and space fans have already been tracking the comet's progress. It will pass at a distance of just under 14 million miles. That's plenty far away for us not to have to worry about it, but close enough for some potentially fun telescope observations. Astronomers and space fans have already been tracking the comet's progress. This comet is famous for major outbursts that make it highly variable in brightness and offers a fascinating piece of space reality on an otherwise whimsical day.
看到没有啊？看到没有？自己接着，让他自己接吧，让他自己接吧。上，接着上，不要急，让他手控制住了。看没有？哎呦，这样子，